Is Donald Trump just shaking things up on the world stage, or is he actually trying to dismantle what one source calls a dying British imperial system? It's a pretty bold claim. In this explainer, we're going to break down the very specific evidence that analysis uses to make its case. So what are they really saying here? The argument is that what we're seeing isn't just random chaos. No, it's a deliberate, calculated takedown of an entire old world order. It's a really provocative idea, so let's dive into how they actually try to back it up. Okay, so the source builds its entire case on three main pillars: a huge shift in geopolitics, a really stark economic contrast, and a deep, fundamental conflict of ideas. We're going to unpack every single one. All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the situation in Ukraine. Then we'll jump to a major economic showdown. After that, we'll define these two competing systems that are at the heart of the whole argument. And then finally, we'll look at what the source says this all means. First up is the geopolitical argument, and the source points directly to the Ukraine peace negotiations as Exhibit A for a massive strategic shift. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. This quote isn't from just anyone. It's from a senior fellow at Chatham House. You can think of them as the British version of the Council on Foreign Relations, a huge deal in foreign policy. And they're admitting out loud that the U.S. has completely sidelined Europe in these critical talks. For the source making this argument, this is not just some small detail about the meeting guest list. They see it as a direct, intentional move to, in their words, throw them off the stage of history. The idea is that peace talks are actually happening because these groups have been shut out of the room. So you might be asking, why is this Chatham House quote such a big deal? Well, according to the source, you have to understand that this institution was supposedly set up over a century ago with one primary goal: to keep the United States aligned with British interests. So from that perspective, for them to be excluded, well, that's a massive, massive development. All right, let's move on to the second pillar of their argument, and you'll see how this builds an economic showdown. For this, the source zooms right in on the G20 summit. So here you've got a statement from Mark Carney, a former major central banker, and he's basically saying the world's economic power is moving away from the US and Europe. It's shifting, but the analysis we're looking at, well, they have a very different take on that. This analysis pushes back hard on Carney's whole idea, and it does so by putting two huge investment deals right next to each other to argue that the real center of gravity isn't shifting anywhere at all. First up, you have a $50 billion deal between Canada and Abu Dhabi, one that Carney himself helped broker. $50 billion, that's a big number, for sure. But just hold that thought for a second. Because then you have this. This is a clip of Donald Trump announcing a totally different deal with Saudi Arabia. Just listen to the number he puts on the table. And there it is, $1 trillion. I mean, according to the source, this is just a giant blinking sign telling you where global capital sees the real opportunity and, more importantly, the real stability. So what's the big takeaway here? For this analysis, it all comes down to that 20-to-1 ratio. It's not just a bigger number, they argue. It is a definitive statement that completely demolishes that idea of a shifting economic center of gravity. And this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. This is where the geopolitics and the economics really come together. The source claims that what we're actually in is a mortal battle between two fundamentally opposed systems of thinking. This slide right here is key because it lays out the two competing worldviews at the heart of this entire analysis. On one side, you've got what the source calls the American system. They say it's a tradition that goes back to leaders like Lincoln, and it's all about building the real physical economy, industry, infrastructure, that kind of stuff. On the other side is the British Imperial System. This one is defined by free trade, financialization, an economy based on speculation, not making things, and a foreign policy that leads to endless war. This is the ideological battlefield. So what's the end game in all of this? Well, according to this analysis, it all boils down to two things: war and money. For centuries, they argue, the imperial system has used these two levers to keep other nations in line. And so the ultimate goal of this jackhammer, as they call it, is to break that control over both. So what does this all mean? When you start to connect the dots, from the geopolitical moves to the economic showdown and this huge ideological battle, a much, much larger picture starts to come into focus. And here's the bottom line from their perspective. The source is arguing that if you're really paying attention, you'll see we're not just watching isolated policy changes or temporary disruptions. No, we're in the middle of a fundamental restructuring of the entire global order, a truly historic pivot point. And that leaves us with the huge question this analysis forces us to ask. Is this viewpoint correct? Are we really watching a deep, systematic deconstruction of a power structure that's been in place for centuries? Or is this all just a turbulent, but ultimately temporary, challenge to the way things are done? The answer to that question could define the world we all live in for generations to come.